Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you were awake. The economist comes up, and I got to make sure that everyone's paying attention because numbers tend to lull people to sleep. So thanks for having me. I've been working on this study for a little while. Let me give a little bit of background about myself. I do an economic newsletter for Mesa County, Delta County, and Montrose County. And so I've been following the Western Slope economy for a couple of years on a quarterly basis. And I've had the privilege of working on a lot of these types of economic impact and economic contribution reports. And so I was excited to dig into the oil and gas industry in the Western Slope and try and figure out exactly how much that industry contributes to the Western Slope economy. So I want to get into it a little bit. The model that I developed here, well, and let me back up a little bit. This is a two-part study. I was here last year and I presented some preliminary results on the first part of the study, which is an analysis of the relationship between rig counts and employment and natural gas prices and employment. And so we found for each rig, we see about 208 employees created per rig. And for price of natural gas, for $1 change in natural gas, we see between 1,200 and 1,400 employees in the Piceance region. And so that's the first half of the report. I presented on that last year. You can read the executive summary, read the report. It's on the Unconventional Energy Center at Colorado Mesa University's. It's on their website. But today I want to talk about the second half of the report, which is the economic contribution to the industry. And you've probably heard the term economic impact. Economic impact is a little bit different than economic contribution. Economic impact is something like a festival, new money coming into an area. So if there's a festival that comes in and people come in and they drop a bunch of money from out of state, that's an economic impact. An economic contribution is going to be where we have an existing industry that contributes to regional GDP. It's a fundamentally different analysis of trying to understand how much of local economic activity is a result of that industry. So this is an economic contribution report, but it's similar to the economic impact reports that you've probably seen for other industries. So the Piceance area was defined as Mesa County, Garfield County, Rio Blanco, Delta, Gunnison, and Moffett. And you know, this is not just adding up wages and ad valorem and coming up with a total. It's a lot more sophisticated than that. When I put these models together, I really invest a lot of time and effort to make sure I account for everything. And so this counts employment and wages, severance taxes, federal mineral lease royalties, ad valorem taxes, sales taxes, and then royalties are all in this. But specifically, all of that stuff added up is adjusted for what really happens in an economy. So you figure there are leakages from the economy. If we go and spend money at a chain restaurant, not all of that money stays local. Some of it leaks out of the economy. So the model accounts for leakages. There are supply chain effects. I know from covering the Piceance economy that when oil and gas ramps up, the construction also ramps up. And so we have supply chain effects of other industries that are affected by the oil and gas industry. And we also have multiplier effects. This is the idea that when oil and gas workers get that big paycheck, they go out and they go to Target and they buy a big screen TV. Well, Target gets a lot of people going through, so they need to hire a couple of other workers. So then those Target workers, then they go off and spend money for things their family needs. They go to Walmart and buy bottles, I don't know, so, you know, something. I'm just thinking about what I spend my money on, sorry, with a small family. But anyways, and so that's the multiplier effect. It's not just the direct spending of the employees, it multiplies through the economy. And so this model takes into account all of these things and it helps accurately determine the total economic contribution of oil and gas in the Piceance. And so the core direct industries that were looked at were these. These are called in-plan codes. They're associated with various NAICS codes, if you're familiar with how the Bureau of Economic Analysis kind of codes industries. But we're looking at extraction of natural gas and crude petroleum, extraction of natural gas liquids, drilling oil and gas, support activities, which is a huge sector, and then oil and gas field machinery and equipment. So here's how I wrote the report, and here's how I'm going to walk you through it. I take each section, if we kind of go back to this right here, I take each section and I show the economic contribution of each section, and then at the end, I show you the total economic contribution. So let me walk you through the steps so you can kind of see the total contribution. And let me explain this. You know, economists, they like to make things as difficult as possible. And that's why I have a job, because then I get to explain it. Otherwise, nobody would call me for anything. So anyways, so this is the direct industry contribution. And you can see that there's a direct effect, indirect effect, induced effect, and total effect. So if you're reading this, the direct effect is the direct employment from the industry. The indirect effect is the supply chain effects. Those are things like construction workers getting jobs as the oil and gas industry picks up, or pipeline companies selling more pipe. The induced effect is going to be that multiplier story. This idea that when people get paid money, they go to the store, they go to a restaurant, and then they have to hire more waiters and waitresses. That's the multiplier effect. And then the total effect is all of them combined. And so that's really what we care about here, is the total effect. You can see up here, this is the number of employees that are directly attributed to each of these phases of the economic contribution. And then you have labor income, which is the wages. You have gross regional product, which is regional GDP. GDP is how economists measure economic activity in an area. It's how we measure growth. And then we have total output, and I'll get to that at the end. We're going to ignore that the first few slides. So the direct contribution of the industry, without any of the other things that were on the list that I showed you, is close to $1 billion. So that's what this number is telling you. To keep things in perspective as I go through these numbers, total GDP for this 6-county area is about $11 billion. Now, the next thing I looked at was severance taxes and federal mineral lease. And to do this study at the state level, I think it wouldn't be too difficult to just get the total severance amount and the total federal mineral lease that's from oil and gas, and then figure out its economic contribution. But at the county level, this was completely insane. Money flows from the counties to the state, and then through several programs and through some pretty complicated formulas, we figure out how much money ends up flowing back at the county level. And so there's no way I could have done the severance and federal mineral lease portion of this study without the help of the nice people at DOLA and also the Department of Natural Resources. I mean, I made a ton of phone calls for this study, and I just feel bad for anybody who had to answer. And so anybody who took a phone call for me to help provide information and to explain how the severance tax and federal mineral lease and ad valorem and all of these things that I've added up, I just want you to know that I appreciate your help. So anyways, my goal here was to try and trace money that leaves the counties and to the state. What I really cared about, though, is the money that comes from the state back to the counties, because that's all that can be counted as economic contribution. Just because we pay a certain amount in severance taxes from an area does not mean that that is economic contribution. It's only counted when it comes back and is spent. And so that was kind of the detective game that I had to play with the help of a lot of people in local government who, once again, were very helpful and friendly. So anyway, so I traced severance tax money through this flow chart, and then I traced federal mineral lease money through this flow chart, and I tried to find the money that came back to the Western Slope as a result of all of these different programs. And then on top of that, I don't just take the money. In this program, I code it based on how it was spent, okay? Because IMPLAN allows me to code certain expenditures that reflect certain interactions with other businesses. So if I code something as a new building construction, that has different economic effects than coding it as, say, general government spending. And so I was really specific, and I got as narrow as I could with every dollar that I could, just so you know. So I don't want to go through all these tables, because there's a lot of numbers. And as an economist, I know that numbers bore everyone but me. So I just want to show you some of the level of detail I went into on this. We looked at direct distribution to the Western Slope and all of the different programs. So here we have total numbers, and then over here we have adjusted numbers. Not all of these programs get money from just oil and gas. Sometimes we had to estimate how much of these dollars were a result of oil and gas, because there are other monies that come from federal mineral lease and severance taxes. And so I dug in and tried to estimate the amount that's associated with oil and gas for every single one of these dollar amounts. We looked at the Energy Impact Assistance Fund. So we had this award total. See, with direct distribution, this previous slide, there weren't a lot of specific, I could code it kind of generally, but there weren't specific spending that I could code it as. The Energy Impact Assistance Fund, there were buildings associated and roads associated. And so I got to go into IMPLAN and pick exactly how this money was spent to get the most accurate economic impact in the model that I could. I went through all of these programs: direct distribution to municipality and county, direct distribution to school districts, the Energy Impact Assistance Fund, State Public School Fund, Small Communities Water and Wastewater Grants, Federal Mineral Lease Revenue Fund. So many phone calls. And the dull people are thinking, oh no, no more. You know, I have an 801 number. I'm from Utah. I moved here about 10 years ago. And so when the 801 number showed up, I'm sure that, no, it's Perry. You should put the phone down. But no, they were absolutely fantastic. So Tier 1 programs, the COGCC, the Department of Natural Resources helped me estimate how much of these general state-level programs ended up back in the Western Slope. Colorado Water Conservation Board, the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, the Avalanche Information Center, all of these spend some of their money out in the Western Slope. And so I meticulously went through, and the Department of Natural Resources meticulously went through and put this list together. Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Couldn't get info for the Colorado Geological Survey. That was the only thing I couldn't find money for. Tier 2 programs, Water Supply Reserve Fund, Species Conservation Trust Fund, Aquatic Nuisance Species. And then there's kind of an overflow mechanism in that flow chart that I have posted, where if there's extra money, there's all these other programs that get money, but there has not been extra money in these programs the last few years. And so there was no funding for an assortment of these smaller programs. The State Public School Fund, we proportioned off how much of that is a result of federal mineral lease. So the total economic contribution, after you adjust for leakages, supply chain effects, and multiplier effects of just severance and federal mineral lease, that comes back to the Western Slope as a result of oil and gas, is about $22 million. And that supports about 328 jobs. Then I looked at ad valorem taxes. So anybody here from a county assessor's office that took my phone call, thank you for letting me bother you as well. So I collected ad valorem tax data as a result of oil and gas extraction, but also we got as detailed as looking at pipeline transportation as a result of extraction. So not pipeline transportation in the sense that it's from the refinery to our homes, but from extraction leaving to market. That ad valorem is, those ad valorem taxes on the transportation is counted in here. And so the total is 86 million, but when you put it into the model, oh, I'm sorry, we also have sales taxes. Sales taxes were harder to come by. Municipalities lower than about 20,000 people do not track sales taxes by industry. And so there are only 3 counties that I was able to get data from. Almost everyone in Mesa, except for Colburn, seems to track by industry. But the smaller the area got, the less resources they had to do that. And so this is a bit of an undercount, but it's the best I could do. I don't want to make up any numbers in terms of sales taxes. So I can only count what I can find. But you have to understand, everything I missed is a really small town and is a drop in the bucket compared to the number that we have here. So anyways, so ad valorem and sales tax contribution, the total economic contribution to GDP is 73 million, sorry. Almost added 3 zeros. Now you're probably thinking, why, if it's 86 million that's collected, why is the economic contribution only 73 million? That's because when you code this the right way, there are leakages from the system. And so there are always leakages out of an economic impact model, at least one that's done correctly by a professional economist. And so the economic contribution is a little bit less than the total collected because of leakages. And then I looked at royalties, private royalties, state royalties, and federal royalties. Federal royalties were impossible to trace in any way back to the Western Slope, but I was able to trace a lot of the state royalties and estimate the private royalties. State royalties come back in the form of what's called the best fund. And I have the amount that comes back and then the adjusted amount based on how much is proportioned of oil and gas, because that best fund has several funding sources. And then private landowner royalties, I estimated. I got some survey data. I didn't get a lot of responses, but I got enough to extrapolate to the full amount. And what I did is I used zip code as a proxy for if that money was being spent here. This is the only part of the report that I would say I'm not 100% confident about, simply because it's an extrapolation from a small amount of data that I had. But if you are concerned with exactness, which I am, I have an appendix that takes this part of the report out and gives you the calculation for economic contribution without this royalty estimate. So that way, you kind of have the two numbers. OK, I'm almost done. 5 minutes. Does that mean I have 5 minutes for questions? Just keep speaking. OK. All right. I like direct people. So no time. OK. So I estimated, and we came up with close to $23 million in terms of private royalties that actually stay here in the Western Slope in the Piceance area. And I coded that. It's kind of complicated in the economic impact software because different incomes spend money different ways. Low incomes spend money differently than high incomes spend money. And I code it as a spending pattern. I had no data on what income levels were collecting these royalties, and so I had to make the assumption to spread it out evenly. Whether that's a good or bad assumption, I don't know, but that's why there's an Appendix D that omits this from the results if you're concerned with the way that I calculated this. I was intent on trying to make an estimate. I feel good about it, but it's not perfect, at least on this part. A lot of the other stuff I feel very, very confident about. So the economic contribution of royalties after you account for leakages is about $10.5 million. So that brings us to the total economic contribution, all of these things added up for this industry in the Piceance region. The oil and gas industry supports almost 11,000 total jobs in the 6-county area. To give you some context, there are about 160,000 total jobs. So we're looking at about, I have to go to the next slide to cheat, 6.6% of total jobs. Now, these jobs pay a lot of money, and so the economic contribution versus the percentage of jobs is higher. And so you can see here we're almost at $1.1 billion, and that equates to about 9.2% of total regional GDP. And so you figure this is Moffett, Rio, Garfield, Mesa, and Delta. Delta doesn't have a lot of oil and gas activity, but they have enough that I felt like I wanted to count it. I was trying to get this number to be the most accurate number for the Piceance. If you omit Moffett and Delta, then this 9.2% right here probably goes a little bit higher because oil and gas is a smaller percentage of Delta and Moffett than it is for Rio, Garfield, and Mesa. And so, but that's not what I was trying to do. I'm trying to get the most accurate number here. But just so you know, if you add a bunch more counties, that number can go down. So this is the key number right here. So in terms of wages, we're looking at about $737 billion of wages in the 6-county area. And let me explain what this total output number is now. I kind of saved it to the last. If you've ever taken an introduction to macroeconomics class, we talk about how GDP is counted. And there's this double counting issue that occurs between GDP and total output. And let me explain. Let's say we're making a car. Okay, there's steel that goes into the car, rubber that goes into the car, plastic, 2,000 in rubber, 2,000 in plastic, 2,000 in steel. Okay, and then the car dealer sells the car for $10,000. Is what's counted in GDP is the final good and service, the value of the final good and service, so the $10,000. But the steel company feels like they felt the $2,000. The rubber company feels the $2,000, and the steel company feels the $2,000. And then the car company, if you ask them what's the value of the car they sold, they'll say $10,000. And so the way industry feels it is really $16,000. Does that make sense? But that's double counting in GDP calculations, the way economists track growth. And so this does not include double counting. This is the number that the economists like. That number you can compare to the total regional GDP of $11 billion. This total output number is how the industry feels it. They're feeling in terms of volume of sales about $1.7 billion. But there's not a comparable number regionally to compare that to like there is with GDP. So just so you know, when you're reading this information, that's how you use it. Stick with the GDP number, and that's what's in the executive summary of my report. I think I've covered everything. Oh, in the report, I have a list of industries that are affected as a result of this model. IMPLAN, the model I use, looks at inter-trade flows between industries and between counties. And they know spending in one industry affects spending in another industry. And so I have a list of the modeled results for how the oil and gas industry impacts other industries as a result of their existence. And so, it's kind of a small table. I just wanted to show you that I have a list in the report that's, that models this. So, anyways, is my 5 minutes up? Did I do good? A little bit long. Can't do anything right. Okay. Do you guys have any questions for me? I'd be happy to field any questions.